members on things relating to nature. We've had a great programme. We started off with low carbon food yesterday, moved on to plastics, had an energy reception last night where anybody who's anything to do with moving ahead on moving away from fossil energy was there, which was great. And today, moving on to biodiversity, what I really enjoyed when I first arrived here this morning was that there was no cow's milk. So we're still on the vibe from yesterday. I think it did arrive, but we actually had to ask for it. So it was oat milk and soya milk was where we started. So isn't that great? We are really able now to supply everybody's needs rather than always having to ask for the soya and the oat milk. Although I have to say I do still quite like cow's milk in my coffee. However, we've got a great panel. We've got Jenna, who's going to talk from the RSPB, first of all, and I gather she might even throw down a challenge for Luke Pollard. For anyone who doesn't know him, is the Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA, if you all like initials, and if you don't like initials, it's the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. I have got that right, I hope, isn't it? Yeah. I can never remember. They've recreated some new department with Michael Gove that makes no sense, and I can't even be bothered to learn what its title is. So I'm going to move straight over to Jenna. They have both promised me that they're not going to arm wrestle, even though she's going to throw down the challenge. They're both going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then there will be plenty of time for questions and points from the floor. So without further ado, Jenna, it's over to you.
Great, thank you. And is that on? Does it sound like it's on? Yeah, great.
It should be, but you have to virtually swallow it.
Okay, here we go. Thank you. So I'm Jenna Hegarty. I'm the Deputy Director for Policy and Advocacy at the RSPB. And our department heads up a whole load of work. Fundamentally, it orients around the fight to save nature, tackling the nature and climate emergencies together as they should be. I'm delighted to be here today, and I will just jump straight in. So we are in the midst of a nature and climate emergency. 41% of the UK species are in decline. 15% are at risk of extinction. We've already lost 2% from our shores entirely. Only 14% of rivers in England are in good ecological condition. So, the stats are frightening. They're really compelling. I don't think there's any real argument against, us being in the climate and nature crisis that we are in. The UN IPBES platform has recently reported that globally nature is declining at an unprecedented rate, and actually it's accelerating rather than slowing down. And climate change is playing a really significant part. Land use change, particularly conversion of pristine habitats for agricultural land use, is actually the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. And that not only leads to more loss of carbon stores, but also essentially leads to more carbon emissions too. So it's a lose-lose. Land use, which works against rather than with nature, is also the primary driver of continued declines in the UK. And that puts our long-term ability to feed ourselves, to store carbon, and to protect ourselves from extreme weather events at really significant risk. Now, nature's importance for all aspects of life is increasingly and really positively being recognised. So the Disruptor review of the economics of biodiversity is a recent very good example. The World Economic Forum highlights that about half of global GDP is dependent either moderately or significantly on biodiversity. So the evidence and the acceptance of its importance is growing. But we know that we're not rising to that challenge globally. So the RSPB produced a report a little while ago called Lost Decade, and that shows that the UK has probably met about 3 of the 20 international commitments that it signed up to at the Convention on Biological Diversity of 2010. So the performance is nowhere near where it needs to be, and sadly that picture is mirrored across the world. So we know nature's in trouble, but we also know it's something that people care really deeply about. It cuts across political, economic, social divides, and its value to many has really hit another level over the course of the pandemic. Its value for our mental well-being, physical well-being has just shot right up. And like a lot of people, I've been working from home largely since last March and spending a lot of time in my garden and basically enjoying the kind of solace of my little pond, which is amazing how much drama can unfold in such a small area. But anyway, back to a slightly grander scale. The UK government's promises on environmental matters have been pretty impressive. The commitments set out in last year's Leaders' Pledge for Nature were very good. Similarly, the Nature Compact at G7, also very good. And we've got some potentially game-changing legislation. But there is loads to do to turn what is essentially rhetoric into action. And there's a really important role for Labour to play in opposition at Westminster, but also in government at regional and national levels across the UK. But what do we want at RSPB? Well, at the global level, the UK has a very, very important role in terms of holding the presidency of COP26. That process has to keep 1.5 alive and really recognise and centralise the role that nature needs to play in mitigating and helping us adapt to climate change. And flowing on from that, it's equally as important that the next CBD COP, so taking place in China next year, sets that really ambitious global biodiversity framework that we need. Now, domestically, the species target that we've seen brought into the Environment Bill, which is still going through, is really, really welcome, but we do need robust and legally binding targets across the bill to drive species and habitats recovery. We also need a really strong watchdog to hold this government and successive governments to account. And we need ambition across the bill to drive change across the piece. So in all areas of government and outside government, and really so that we can manage our natural assets much, much better. We can really switch the way that we as society value and invest, and not just in nature, but invest full stop. And the CSR is a really important test that's coming up of that. Now, last week marked the kind of 1 year anniversary of the launch of Leaders' Pledge for Nature, and we looked at what progress the UK government has made, and almost every area domestically there is urgent and significant action needed. Two examples, one being the 30 by 30 debate, so protecting 30% of land and sea by 2030, something we strongly support. A recent paper by RSPB scientists has highlighted that as little as 5% of UK land is actually well managed for nature. So we're a long, long way away from 30%, and we're nowhere near the 28% that the UK government is currently claiming. And similarly, there's a really long way to go before the schemes flowing from the Agriculture Act actually deliver the public money for public goods at the scale required to turn things around. And that's something that many progressive farmers are clamouring for, and they're just not seeing coming through yet. So we're seeking a really high level of ambition from government, and we'll be making that challenge next week. But Labour also needs to kind of be equally ambitious. So at Westminster, that means, for example, locking in the progress that the House of Lords have made in the Environment Bill. In Wales, the Labour government really needs to start delivering on its promises in the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act, and to catch up on both agriculture and environmental governance. And where Labour is in power at local and regional levels, mayors and councils really do need to be declaring ecological emergencies and following that up with the action that they can do and that's required. So investing in green business, in ensuring that there's more access to nature-rich green spaces, and supporting planning system that helps and restores nature, or helps protect and restore nature. And the RSPB will definitely be playing our part. We have agreed a new ambitious strategy to 2030, and then this decade, we'll be scaling up delivery on the land that we manage for nature. We'll be working with more and more diverse stakeholders to really make the case for positive change, and probably more than ever than we've ever done before. We'll be holding government and the opposition to account. So I do want to challenge Labour today, Luke and his Shadow DEFRA team, as well as Keir and the whole party, to really push for even greater ambition on the environment and the natural world, and delivering it where you've got the power to do so. And the prize is immense. I mean, we are literally talking about the foundation of society here, so it's no kind of small matter. And it is the decade in which we need to turn things around, bend that curve for nature's recovery, more birdsong, more woodlands, more natural meadows, more seagrass, cleaner, greener, more kind of equitable, nature-rich spaces for us all to enjoy. And that's a legacy we want to be part of, and we want you to be part of as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So a challenge for all of us in the room, I think, not just for Luke, but we're going to move straight on to Luke, who, as I said, is our Shadow Secretary of State for DEFRA, who's going to riposte Jenna, but also open up the discussion further, and then we'll come to you for comments and questions. Luke.
That's great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for those remarks. I think I'm going to agree with all of them, actually. And I think we need to recognise the place where we are at the moment. So we are in the middle of a climate and ecological crisis. It is not enough for us just to talk about carbon. As a party, actually, we're quite comfortable talking about carbon. We've got good, strong measures on carbon. We've got a good legacy on carbon. In fact, the majority of the carbon emissions that have been cut from our economy is because of the last Labour government forcing through the closure of coal-fired power stations. But we're not seeing the same heavy lifting on carbon under this government that we need to. But carbon's only part of the solution. We have a choice about solving a climate crisis and an ecological crisis together, or solving neither of them. And I think as a movement, we need to be much more comfortable and relentless in saying that it's not just carbon, it's also nature that we need to do. Now, whether you call it an ecological crisis, a nature crisis, a biodiversity crisis, to a large extent they're interchangeable, because it's about a focus on the natural world, on the species that we are losing, the vulnerable and fragile habitats, the amazing planet-wide services that our oceans, our forests, our green lungs, our peatlands, our grasslands all provide. And we do need to make sure that as a movement, we are mentioning that as well. So I am on a one-person mission to try and stop us saying climate change, because I think climate change is too passive. So if I am to only use two words, I will say climate crisis or climate emergency. But I will try to, each time, say climate and ecological crisis, because mentioning the other part of it is a really important reminder that when we are tackling climate, it's not just technological solutions and cutting that we need to do of carbon emissions. It's also building back better in a proper, meaningful, real way in our green environment. And we're seeing this year, I think that the climate crisis is really taking roots. We've seen more people die in those flash floods that we're seeing. We've seen heat and weather bombs around the world. We're seeing firestorms. We're seeing it being made real. But actually, for our natural world, there's extinction level events for species happening nearly every single day. There's habitats that are being lost nearly every single day. And as a country, the UK is actually one of the most nature depleted countries on the planet. We lost an awful lot of species. Now, some of you will know, if you follow my Twitter feed, that I bloody love bees. And we have lost 13 out of 35 species of native bees. And so this matters. And although bees might be a kind of like the insect version of those great beasts, the elephant or the lions that we look at in terms of species protection elsewhere, it's not just bees. It's a whole host of other creepy crawlies, insects, bird life, mammals that are at risk. And we need to take more steps to do so. But we also need to recognize that it's not just on land, it's also in water. So that means taking meaningful steps to provide marine protection, make sure that marine protection is valued and understood by people, but also recognizing that our marine environment is what is currently saving us from climate crisis due to the amount of carbon that the oceans suck up. But that's having a consequence. So I think there's enormous potential around seagrass and kelp as carbon sequesters that we need to do. But also it creates enormous opportunities to create more protected, meaningful marine environment, marine protections along the way, which we have to do. Now, I think we all know in this room that the Tories are failing us on the environment. I think it is actually quite terrible. It's not that they don't care, it's just that they've created an illusion that they are doing stuff when they're not. So if they were in a state of denial, we could argue against that. Good factual science basis against denial. But we're not there. As Ed Miliband said on the stage yesterday, it's about climate delay, climate pretending that actually the steps they're taking are sufficient. Because it reassures people that we don't need to go further and faster, that we don't need to do more along the way. And we absolutely do. And I think we as a movement need to be more confident and bolder about calling that out and clear about what we want to achieve. Now, I think we need to go beyond just a net zero for nature. So the Environment Bill that was mentioned earlier, I have to say, and apparently I'm the first person to say it in Parliament, is a bit meh. It's all right. I mean, the thing about it is, yeah, it's fine. Is it an adequate and proportionate response to the scale of the crisis we are in? No, it's not. Clearly not. Will it do some good? Yeah. Are there bits about it that we welcome? Yeah. Does it get me fired up that I think this is the flagship legislation that is going to change the world? No. In fact, it gets me angry that it's pretending to be, because we do need to go faster and further. And that's where the challenges that Jenna came out, just briefly mention those before I turn to questions. We managed to succeed as a party, working cross-party in the Lords, to get some really good wins to the Environment Bill. really good, important changes, not just about air quality, but about targets, about strengthening the pretty useless lapdog watchdog, the Office of Environmental Protection, which doesn't anywhere near go far enough to be independent and to be bold enough in holding the government to account. We will be voting for those amendments when they come back in a few weeks' time in the House of Commons, and it will be the Tories that won't. And one thing we must make sure is that our stakeholder friends are not lulled into the false sense of security. They can say, we need to hold the opposition to account for this. We need to say, Labour's voting for those amendments. Why aren't you Conservatives? That's a factual statement. It's not partisan. Let's be clear about it. The opposition parties will be supporting these amendments. Government MPs will not. Let's call it out for what it is. Because I'm tired of getting BBC News alerts where it says MPs have voted for something awful. Well, no, Tory MPs have voted for something awful. Labour MPs voted against it. Let's be clear and tell that story about how we go. In Wales, actually, I think Wales is making good progress, and I think their decisions around some of their agricultural work is still to come. I think look like going in the right direction, but I agree we all need to go faster, and I think they're doing a good job of getting there. Most Labour councils have now declared a climate emergency. Most Labour councils have a robust plan to implement about not only about cutting carbon and understanding where carbon comes from, but about nature restoration. The challenge, I think, for those that have declared a climate emergency is not just the initial plan that came out of it, but how you ramp that up. Because tree planting is fine and absolutely essential, and we're missing our current tree planting targets as a country by 73%. So we are pretty useless at that. But actually, tree planting will take many, many decades to probably get to the point of carbon sequestration that we need. So what are the measures that we need as well? And planting bushes might not be as exciting, but actually can have, in many cases, a bigger immediate effect on air quality and carbon as along the way. I think what Labour will be saying in the next few weeks or so is making steps towards where we are on nature. We have a net zero target of 2050 as a country. 2050, as far as I'm concerned, is 1 million years away. It enables governments to park things and push it into the long grass. Those interim targets need to be better understood. I'm a net zero by 2030, not a net zero by 2050 kind of person, but I think all of us in the room will understand that the failure to deliver the heavy lifting that we need means that a 2030 target is harder and harder with each passing day of inaction that we see from the government. But I want to see an equivalent for nature. A species abundance target in the Environment Bill is insufficient to deliver that, especially when the scale of ambition is just to slow the decline, really, in the species abundance target. And I haven't really heard anyone in the pub say species abundance, have you? But I am starting to hear them say net zero. And so there is a challenge here. And what we will be setting out as a party is how we can put together an equivalence for nature that makes that work, not only structurally in terms of accountability, but also in terms of what it means. So you've already seen that with Keir announcing that all our policies will be subject to a net zero and nature test when they're announced. That is an important step that actually says there's two sides of this crisis and both matter. So all our policies in the manifesto will be tested against those two tests, which is a good thing. But we need to go further than that. So more focus on land use, more focus on recovery, more focus on rivers, because I think the water companies have got away with polluting our rivers for far too long. There's a focus on beaches and bathing waters correctly, but rivers have been left behind, and there are huge amounts of habitats that are being destroyed in that. There's a lot of work to do, and my challenge to you, like giving out homework, is when you are doing the things in your organisation or in your local party, make sure the interventions, the arguments that you're putting forward aren't just about carbon. They need to be about nature at the same time as well. And then we stand a better chance of actually dealing with carbon, better chance of protecting the environment at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so a lot of homework there, I think, actually. And I think one of the urgent things, there may be some people in the room who may be Labour members, but don't necessarily have a Labour MP. And I think the bill is coming back from the Lords on the 20th of October. So your homework is between now and the 20th of October is to write to your local Conservative MP and try and persuade them to change their mind and to do the right thing for nature. Right, I've seen one hand, which is over there. Can I see? There's a second hand over there. So I'm going to take you three. Right, I am going to go back to the traditional taking them in threes. I can see Sandy Martin is down there. He took them in ones yesterday. So I saw you first, and I'm going to take you now. Thank you. Yeah, and if you can wait for the microphone, it just makes it a lot easier. This room is not great on acoustics.
Thank you. I'm Neil Ward from Norwich, from the University of East Anglia. Great presentations, and there was little that really one would want to quarrel about in what was said. I wonder if I can just try and draw you a little bit further. 41% species decline, big problems with river water quality. A large driver of these problems is the way that we manage our land for agriculture. And when one looks at what we're to do about agriculture and land management in the coming decade or so, a lot of the debate is about our funding schemes and changing our system of financial incentives to pay farmers and land managers to do things differently. But of course, that's not the only way that you can get agriculture to do things differently. And if you look back over the last 40 years or so, you see BSE and cattle traceability, you see foot and mouth and cattle movements and pollution controls in the 80s and so on and so on. So there's a balance between paying farmers to do things and changing our kind of regulatory baseline to require and compel people to do things differently.
Thank you. I don't want to
Can I just ask you, where would you stand on the balance? Have we got that right, or do we need to shift that balance between payment and regulation?
That's a great question. Sorry to, if people can be really short, because I want to try and get as many in as possible. That is a brilliant question to start with. There were two people just in the middle there. The one at the back was first. It doesn't matter. Oh, thank you. Very kind.
Hi, thanks to the speakers. This isn't a question so much, but I just want to give you an illustration. I'm from Skipton and Ripon CLP. I'm a Labour Party delegate. But in our community, we've actually had to buy 38 acres of land, almost 3,000 shareholders, to stop the council, putting a road through it, continuously trying to put a bypass through it, and so that we can try and restore the land. That's the lengths that local communities are having to go to, because local politicians, and it's not a Labour area, but local politicians, whether that's, you know, MPs, local government councillors, they're just failing us. They're just looking at all the wrong things, and it's up to us. You know, everyone's basically completely lost faith in the system to deliver, and we're taking things into our own hands, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but why should I have to put my own money buy land restore it for nature?
There's another great question about balance, but also about personal activism there. So we'll come back to that with the speakers, and I'll take you third. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, my name's Jo Blackman. I'm a Labour councillor, also work at Global Witness on deforestation there. I'm sorry I missed the first intervention, so you may have already covered this, but I was wondering if there's any thoughts from the panel on our global impacts on biodiversity. So not just what happens within these shores, but we know obviously UK, through its financing and supply chains, actually has a massive impact globally. And Luke, it's great to hear that you'll be assessing all of those policies against that. But I think we can't lose sight of actually what we allow UK financing to do, UK-based banks and also supply chains. And there was positive stuff in the Environment Bill, but obviously a hell of a lot more that can be done, and hope Labour will do as well.
Okay, so three great questions to start with. And I'm going to come first to Luke, and then I'm going to come to Jenna, and then I'll reverse that next time. Luke.
Yep, thank you. They're great questions. I'll go in reverse order if I can. I think, Joe, we do need to recognise that we are a global trading nation. Our systems currently assess biodiversity and carbon about what happens within the UK. So carbon is really encountered when it lands on our port, and we don't have any real decent measurement for biodiversity impacts elsewhere. Now, the Environment Bill does include, for the very first time, an assessment around forestry and international forestry supply chains. That's welcome. It's a start. It's a good start, but it ends far too quickly. And I think there's an opportunity to look at how that system can be accelerated to other areas along the way. I think we also need to recognise that the trade deals that are being signed at the moment by government has potentially a massive biodiversity impact on a global scale. So allowing food that is produced to lower environmental and animal welfare standards from around the world to undercut our farmers at home means not only are we putting our own farmers out of business, we are also offshoring the carbon intensity and the nature decline at the same point. So that's not only about antibiotic use, that's not only about Australian feed stations, it's not only about fly strike on sheep. It's an enormous amount of river pollution, water pollution, land pollution, the behaviours and practices that see nature's and wildernesses cleared for agricultural production that Jenna mentioned right at the start. We need to better understand that, but we also need to be better at demanding from organisations and from government about whole supply chain monitoring. Now, that is a bit of admin, that's a bit of cost, but actually it lifts quality and it lifts the, well, it reduces the impact, because we should be having a race to the top, not the race to the bottom. And I fear at the moment the rhetoric's going one way and the action from government's going the other. So we need to be very aware of that. Neil's question around the balance between payment and regulation is a really good one. So I'm quite proud that in the last 2 years, Labour and the National Farmers Union have probably the best relationship we have had for decades. That's not because we agree with them on everything. We disagree on the badger cull. We disagree on elements of some type of farming practices, but we have found common cause in supporting decent, lower carbon, more environmental farming methods in the UK, preserving jobs in our rural communities rather than offshoring stuff. Now, the balance between the transition from a common agricultural policy to environmental land management schemes, or ELMs, is not quite right at the moment. I can't, if I'm honest, see what it looks like, because even as a big Remainer, I was not a fan of the common agricultural policy. It was pretty rubbish, and it had the wrong incentives, the wrong results. The ELM scheme that's being introduced is being introduced before, only after the government's had massive cuts in this area. It looks like it is about attacking small family farms. It looks like it's in favour of massive industrialisation, aggregation and mechanisation of our farming production, with newer technologies, gene editing potentially being part of that mix. I don't think we've got a balance yet, but equally, if I'm answering your question perfectly honestly, I can't see where the balance from government is at the moment, about where they're going.
Conservative councillors and say, why haven't you got better protection for nature in this local plan? Now, it does have to conform with the national planning policy framework. In London, we also have the London plan. If you want to see some quite good things in the London plan, have a look in there, and also have a look at a report, slight puff for myself, but I did a report on biodiversity and the mayor's new housing developments, and it's how you can preserve biodiversity even when you are building some of these new things. And it's a really important balance, which comes back to the very first point that was made. Jenna, do you want to come in on any of those points?
Yeah, I'll just take them in the order that they came in. So on agriculture, And you're right, that a lot of the debate is about the schemes, and I totally agree that it's not just about publicly funded incentive schemes in terms of what's needed to drive change. I think the regulatory baseline absolutely should be seen as a shifting baseline that needs to shift upwards over time, and that's something that has not been at all consistently applied. And the current government's approach to regulation in the round is very worrying. There's Lord Frost's speech fairly recently, talk of returning to kind of 1 in, 2 out. I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense at all. And so I think as we approach, for example, there's a particular milestone where cross compliance, which obviously speaks back to the cap system of old, where that is no more. There will be, I think, real gaps in the regulatory baseline that we need to tackle. Probably around soil health and quality being one. And one of the targets that we want to see really robustly in the Environment Bill is around soil health and quality. So again, that could be a really good example of where the Environment Bill is sending a strong signal to other parts of the world in terms of change. The only other thing that I wanted to say there is obviously it's not just about kind of public incentives or regulation. The role of the market in terms of driving change is also really significant. So there's a lot that's food producers, suppliers, retailers can do to essentially require progressive, nature positive modes of production alongside instead of publicly subsidized approaches. So and I think that needs to grow significantly, and I think there's a really kind of hungry market for that. On the kind of buying of the local land, I think I probably can't add too much to what's already been said, other than again, all power to your elbow. I think it is brilliant when local communities kind of go, this is a really important area for us. Whether that's it's amazing for nature, therefore we're going to protect it, or we don't want it to be lost to kind of inappropriate built development. In terms of demonstrating kind of what an alternative and what good looks like, I think that's great. I think the the planning system is potentially up for some shaky changes. We don't know what's going to come. There's obviously been quite a change in terms of the reshuffle, but I think that that's a really important opportunity to make the case for all built development essentially being nature positive, and it is possible. It's totally doable, and you take nature into account at the beginning. It's so much easier. And it just becomes part of the process. So it can be win-win. On the global impacts, yeah, absolutely. I mean, the RSPB produced a report, in fact, produced 2, risky and then riskier business with WWF in terms of the UK's global overseas footprint. We had a look at about 8 commodities, which are kind of the higher kind of risk commodities like palm and timber products, and our footprint is immense. So the opportunities to tackle illegal deforestation through due diligence in the Environment Bill is a step in the right direction, but illegal deforestation is part of the problem. I mean, deforestation, full stop, is a big problem. So we need to be tackling that, as well as the inappropriate land use changes that mean we're losing really pristine ecosystems, habitats overseas. The only thing I wanted to, I suppose, add there, I fully support the kind of trade points. The UK spends a fair whack of money, albeit it has reduced in relative terms recently, but on overseas development assistance, that is a really important way in which the UK government can support positive, sustainable land management overseas, which is not being kind of deployed, in the best way currently. So I think that's a really lost opportunity and just part of the mix. The only other thing that I was going to say was around bioenergy. So that's something that organisationally is something we're interested in. Personally, I do find it quite fascinating. We've got power stations in the UK that are, receiving like masses of public financial support. Drax being a notable example, which is being fired by forestry, trees from overseas. It doesn't make sense on carbon grounds. It's driving deforestation overseas, and we're paying through the nose for it as taxpayers. And that is just one example of just that kind of inconsistency of approach. So That's all I've had.
Wood chip
Good
from
points.
America. Right, more questions. Put your hands up. Oh my goodness, I knew you'd do that to me. To put your hands up simultaneously. Right, I'm going to try and take everybody because I think we've got about 25 minutes left. So we'll start with this person here who you're near to, Tracy, and then we'll come to you at the front, and then I've got 4 over here. Okay.
Thanks. Oh, blimey, that was loud. Thanks. I'm Andy Achillios from Dagenham and Rainham CLP. I'm a councillor in Barking and Dagenham, and I hold the climate change brief. Local authorities are forever publishing action plans on roadmaps to net zero, biodiversity action plans, air quality action plans. But when you actually look into it, there's very little ongoing monitoring to make sure that these plans are delivered. I just wondered, is there a role for organisations such as RSPB and also MPs? Because there's a lot of focus on central government, but is there a role to actually look and scrutinise more at what local authorities are doing to deliver these so that they don't just become PR stunts and sound bites?
That's a big challenge there, I think, and quite accurate too. We'll come to you at the front.
Hiya, Adam. I work for Friends of the Earth, though ex RSPB. I just wanted to ask about grouse moors. So they have an amount of land in England larger than Greater London, some of the most nature depleted, intensively managed land in the country. I mean, Scotland introduced some reforms recently on sort of introducing licensing and banning peat burning. And obviously we had some progress in England with restrictions on peat burning as well. I just wanted to ask the panelists' views on sort of reforming grouse moors and how Labour can sort of keep the pressure up on getting those reforms through.
Okay. Yeah, just at the back, and then we'll come forward.
Hi, Adam Deister, work for National Trust, used to be at CERA. Luke, you're talking about pub conversations, and I don't think nature positive features in those, but I do think green spaces, particularly during the pandemic, really would now.
Yeah.
We've all used our local parks and our green spaces and realised how much they're important to us. How can we build on that love for our local environment to protect it, but also to improve it for those who didn't have access, particularly those without a garden, those are the most unequal areas?
Okay, can you pass that a couple of rows forward? Sorry to the panelists, but I'm going to make you take 25 questions. Well, not quite.
Hi, Cassie Staines from the Woodland Trust. Luke, you talked about how we're woefully missing our tree planting targets and that we need to do more on that, which is really welcome. Would you agree that we also need to do a lot more to protect the irreplaceable habitats that we already have, including ancient woodland, which play a huge role in biodiversity and carbon store?
Thank you. Now, there was somebody down here. There's 2 people here at the front and then someone else just at the back. So I'm going to bring you all in and then that's it. And then expect the panelists to answer.
Hi, Lydia Hyde, Rochton South End East. My question's about, I feel at the moment, the discussion out in the public is all about Greenbelt, and there's an obsession with the Greenbelt that is the solution that fits all. Actually, locally in Southend, we have a brownfield site. It's got 11 sites of scientific interest on it. And so my question is this: how do we change the dialogue around the Greenbelt and take into appreciation how we can improve our biodiversity in brownfield and also in our towns and cities?
Do you want to just pass that back? Thank you.
Thank you for fitting us all in. My name's Laura Thompson. I'm from Lewisham, Deptford, CLP. And I just wanted to say that in our local party meetings, we've been discussing the fact that on the doorsteps, people really want to talk about green issues, and we don't feel like our opposite. It's, as you know, big Labour majority, Labour mayor, 3 Labour councillors. It's very safe. There's an army of people wanting to go and put the message out in that area of London. And what we're finding is that it's the green issues which are our real opposition. And we need a clear message to take to the doorsteps, not just on targets and what might be done and what could be done. People don't want to hear about that, I'm afraid, very much. But what are you going to do? What is being done? What has been done? That's what they want to know. Why should they vote Labour? Because at the moment, I don't think on the ground, Labour does connect with those issues very well. So we really need the pressure to stay on, and then the message to be very, very clear so we can take it out, because I think there's a misconception that only rural areas care about environmental issues, and actually nothing could be further from the truth. Londoners in South London are absolutely passionate about rewilding and green spaces. I think it's the common denominator that connects all communities, that everyone cares about this. So no pressure, but it's really important.
Actually, I think that means there's a failure of communication about all the things we've been doing at City Hall. And maybe I need to come and speak on behalf of Sarah at one of your CLP meetings on nature issues, which would be the fastest way to answer that, because there's a lot that we have done. Net biodiversity gain and an urban greening factor in the London plan mean that we're actually able to do things right now. But I'm answering your question, and we still have one more at the back there. And by the way, if you think I'm abusing my position as the chair, there are only 3 panellists, partly because I think Sarah knows that I have a passion for this subject, and I am allowed to speak from the chair, in other words. Finally.
Hi. Thanks. Laurie Marriott from Randall's Monitoring. So my partner is a secondary school teacher in Hackney, and many of the students that he teaches they've literally never left, Greater London in their lives, so they've not seen, a cow in a field, let alone a kingfisher or something. So my question, given what we know about all of the various benefits of access to nature, my question is, how can we encourage and also ensure access to nature for everyone, but particularly people from deprived areas, and particularly young people as well, so they can grow up to be individuals that care about the environment and nature?
I'm going to prevent myself from answering that question as well and come back to our panellists. I'm going to start with Jenna. Don't feel that you need to answer them all. Pick out ones that you want to answer, and then I'm going to force Luke to answer all the ones you didn't.
Okay, right.
Seems fair.
So, well, no, I will say something on each of them, because they were all brilliant questions. And I was very good with noting names down for most of them. There might be 2 that I just didn't. Anyway, so Andy first. Should we be scrutinising local plans more? I mean, always. I'm a big fan of scrutiny. There is always the perennial issue of capacity. I mean, fortunately, the RSPB is not the only environmental organisation out there. There are many of us, and there are many really bottom up and increasing numbers of passionate people who I think want to get stuck in. So I think the short answer is yes. And I'm kind of looking at my colleague on the front row who spends all of her kind of working time working at kind of the sub-national kind of mayoral local authority levels. But I would really view this as a space for kind of committed members of the public to get much more stuck into, and I think that they're there and they're really hungry for that. So that is probably on that one. Adam, on grouse moors, you probably know better than me what the RSPB position is on grouse moors, but you're right, there is a fundamental problem in terms of how many of the grouse moors in this country are managed. The levels of birds of prey persecution, inside grouse moors versus outside is, let's say, statistically significant. So there is definitely something going on that is not quite as it should be. The land is put very simply, is managed with one kind of interest in mind, which is producing as many kind of baggable birds as you can, rather than actually taking a robust approach to what that land is delivering for wider society. I mean, peat is, one of the most important natural assets that we hold in this country, and there is no place for burning on peat soils in any scenario. There is a positive development in terms of banning of burning on peat in protected areas, but protected areas don't cover all of our peat resources. And we know that voluntary approaches don't really work. So if you're relying on that outside protected areas, it's going to fail. So we need a really kind of concerted, strong leadership effort on peat, especially as we run up to COP26. I mean, there will be nothing more embarrassing than if we open up in Glasgow and we have got fires burning on UK peat soils, which is probably going to be happening somewhere. I will move on to Adam from National Trust. So how can we build on the kind of increased value that people are playing on or putting on local green spaces? So, I mean, in a previous life, I worked for something called the Green Flag Award Scheme, which still exists, I believe. I've definitely seen flags knocking about. And once upon a time, in fact, it was when Labour were in power, that was viewed as a kind of well, essentially, like one of the indicators of success. If it was a real kind of drive for local authorities to be Green Flag Award Park winners, and it directed a whole load of resources towards green space management, and biodiversity was a really key component of that. I think there is more that our existing green spaces can do for nature. I think we're seeing some shifts, and there are some really progressive places that are viewing kind of how you simple things like rather than mowing all the grass, mowing pathways through it, so you're letting grass actually grow like it's supposed to, set seed, provide a really important feed source for insects and other things. So there's loads more to be done, and I would hope that the local authorities are kind of seeing this as the opportunity is, but also that the funding that is going to be required to, I think, turn around a long time of underinvestment in our green spaces is reversed. Yeah, sorry. I'll tell you what, I won't answer all the rest. What am I going to say next? I'm going to pick out the tree planting one. So Cassie's question. So trees, really important. We're a big supporter of more trees with a focus on native broadleaf woodland in the UK. We do have some concerns about the government's tree planting targets, essentially placing an emphasis on one type of habitat, potentially at the expense of others. And we've got a range of amazing habitats. Heathland being one that we are kind of internationally renowned for, and we know that there are in places some conflict with tree planting schemes and other habitats. So that's something that I think we need to be really careful about. But fully support your point about ancient woodland protection. That stuff is irreplaceable. So there should be no situation where our current approach to planning essentially allows irreplaceable habitat to be lost. And what was the last one I'm going to talk about? So probably the last one in terms of how we can encourage nature for everyone. So I don't come from a classic kind of nature background. I grew up in a very urban South Yorkshire town. My family didn't do countryside walks. It wasn't, just they didn't get it. So I actually came to nature much later as an adult. And I think that's really sad. I think the value of nature should be absolutely in our curriculum. There are amazing spaces for nature inside many of our urban areas. I just think people don't often know about them. There need to be more of them. They need to be more, bigger, better joined up, and that's something that I hope we can really drive in this decade. But we need to make sure that these our young people are actually able to visit these places in the first place.
Thank you, Luke.
They were really good answers, so I'll try not to repeat any of those. Great questions. Right, Andy. I look at a lot of local councils' response to climate emergencies that they've declared, and they will talk about how we want some electric cars, how we probably want to persuade our bus company to replace dirty diesel with something a bit nicer, how we'll try and get some charging points somewhere, and about how we'll plant some trees. And beyond that, there's not a huge amount of generic radical action across the board. Partly, it's now a compulsory, non-compulsory element of being a good council to have one of these. But the standardization, the sharing of best practice isn't there. The LGA website's got some really good best practice that can be shared. And I think where those plans work best is when there is active scrutiny of them, both from councillors and from community groups. That's not only stakeholders, but if you look at, say, Labour-run Oxford City Council, a brilliant council, taking their climate emergency declaration and really turbocharging the interventions that they can get there. Admittedly, they have a community that is very, very motivated around this area. However, that's a great place to borrow best practice. And I don't think there's enough best practice borrowing that goes on at the moment. I don't think we have the right level of floor standards for what the expectation is, but don't just go on the carbon reductions. Make sure there's nature included. I think they briefly mentioned by our chair about building nature into stuff. If I could spend an hour talking about Swift bricks, I would. Swift bricks, amazing breeze blocks with holes in that little swifts, those fantastic little birds make their nests in. It is about building nature into new development. and it can be done. It just requires thought. And so you can put that in your local plan as planning restrictions. You can put it as, your grand designs, Kevin MacLeod, local vernacular. Make something that builds nature into your developments, not only in new developments, but in retrofits as well. So there's lots that we can do there. I think the answer about grouse moors has been well answered by my colleague. However, we need to go further. I think rotational burning is not good enough. I think we need to have a better understanding of it, but we don't value our upland areas in the way that we need to as a country. They're not recognised with the same type of both protection but also passion that I think they should be. And so I think there's a lot of work that still needs to be done there. Olivia Blake in my team, Shadow Minister, is personally committed to this as a Yorkshire MP and is doing lots on it. So there's more to come on that one. Adam, you're tempting me just to say that we want to cut and paste your National Trust excellent access to nature policy. But if I say that, I will be revealing an announcement we're making in the future. So I can't possibly say that. But for those that might not have written it, it's effectively saying that we need to have an idea, a plan as to what is the proximity to nature, to a green space that people should have. Now, depending on which group you speak to, either that is a 15-minute walk, a 10-minute walk, a 4-minute walk. The whole point is it's a short walk to nature, however it's defined. And that nature space must both be, could be a managed nature space, a green park with a green flag, or it could be an area of rewilding. It could be a proper space that includes water features. There is a real opportunity to do that. And I think the public health benefits of access to nature is tangible, it's calculable, and it's something that we are missing out on by not having it as part of our overall approach. And so watch out for that and don't copyright it in the meantime, please. Cassie's question about trees. I'm a bit concerned about our tree planting because it gives we currently give the impression we're doing enough when we're not. We currently give the impression that we plant a full range of trees when we don't. We currently give the impression that there's enough nurseries growing trees in the first place for the level of tree planting that we need. And we are nowhere near that. The government is currently trying to shut down and privatise one of its own government-owned nurseries, which seems a complete betrayal of their objectives here. So we absolutely do need to do more about planting new areas of woodlands, but we also need to protect the ones that we have already. And I think the government counts trees planted, it doesn't count trees lost. And when it's not counting trees lost, that is any old tree or the most valuable ones. And so there is more work that can be done there. There will always be a certain element of tree replacement that is necessary. And I think strong environmental groups recognise that. But a mature tree that's been there for hundreds of years is not the same as a whip or a sapling that has been planted in its replacement, both in terms of biodiversity contribution and carbon sequestration. So let's be real about that. And I think we need to be much better building more nature net gain into there. I think the government's nature net gain is good. Local councils in many cases have been having further net gains than the government policy. And so there's great examples of councils going further than government wants them to on this. We need to do more on that. Lydia's question about brownfield. My preference for building is on brownfield before greenfield. Of course it would be along the way, but we do need to recognise that habitats come in all different shapes and sizes and all different forms. And although there are, I'm sure, groups that go around putting protected slow worms in front of stuff along the way, we do need to recognise that biodiversity is not just about a rolling countryside. It can be about urban biodiversity as well. So we do need to value that a lot more, but we also need to realise that pockets of biodiversity in urban areas can contribute hugely to the well-being of the human population, the nature population, but those pockets need to be a coherent network across an urban area. So when you're, example, setting up bee corridors or wildflower meadows along the way, they need to be coherent. They need to be in a way that actually you are getting more from just one bit, because apparently by working together you achieve more. So my music card says, but you can do that by picking up those areas there. Laura, I agree. I think we need to do more on green. And for me, I've found last year quite frustrating because many of the things that myself, the Shadow DEFRA team want to do, we haven't been able to do because the public have correctly been focused on the pandemic. That means there is now a build-up of announcements that we want to make, that we want to change the nature of some debates by making. And we need to be doing that, and we will be doing that over the next few months or so, assuming that there's no massive flare up again in the pandemic. So we will need to make it a case. And in a couple of weeks' time, you'll be hearing more from me about nature, about building out some of the things that I alluded to in my opening remarks. But I agree with you, we do need this. But one thing I would say is there's sometimes a view that people in urban areas, it's the people in rural areas that care about nature. And sometimes people in rural areas think it's only the people in urban areas that care about nature. Everyone cares about nature. And one thing we as a movement must be better at is calling out this nonsense that says if you're in a less affluent community, you care less about nature and climate change than if you're in a more affluent community. The only distinction, the only difference there is if you live in a more affluent community, you have more agency, you have more ability to influence. And one of the things we must do as a party is realise that if you are on low incomes in the private rented sector, you don't have the agency to swap out your boiler or to put external wall insulation on or to change your car potentially. But what you can do is influence your natural world around you. And I think as a movement, we need to embrace nature-based solutions as a way of delivering our socialism, delivering our values in communities. I think there's a real opportunity there in terms of doing that. And Laurie, your question, I think, warms my heart. I'm a Plymouth MP. I represent a very poor city. And we're Britain's ocean city. We are very proud of our marine heritage. And there are people living 100 metres from the sea who have never seen it. 20% of our kids in Plymouth have never seen the sea. 50% of our kids in Plymouth have never been on a beach. That's because of deprivation. That's because of lack of private transport. That's because of horizons that are far too close. So Wes Streeting announced, I think, what could be the most game-changing policy for our young people that I've heard for a very long time. And that was the 10 by 10 policy. There was a lot coming out the last couple of weeks. If you missed it, please take the moment to look at it. 10 by 10 says there's 10 things every child by the age of 10 should experience. This isn't just about cramming in more Progress 8, cramming in more reading and maths into our young kids. It's by saying, actually, by giving our children access to things they wouldn't normally see, and great things in there, access to our marine environment, to a beach, and access to the countryside should be those things that every child by the age of 10 should do. And I know that if you give a child that opportunity to go beyond their horizons, that will deliver a lifelong benefit for that child and the community as well. I think it's a transformative policy. And I'm really glad that we've had the courage to make it and to make it with such gusto, because that will change the life chances of many of our kids, because behind that policy will now sit spending commitments, will now sit a policy drive and a determination from the top, from Keir, from Rachel and the rest of the team to deliver that. And I think it is potentially really good. But let's not wait for a Labour government to get there. 10 by 10 can be delivered by local councils, whether we're in power or whether we're in opposition. So let's seize that moment. Let's seize those policies, because Labour's already in government in large parts of the country. Let's put that policy into action. Final thing I just want to say is we do need to do more on green. As a party, we do need to do more on green, not just because we're in the middle of a climate crisis, but because if we want to be in power, we need everyone to understand what we will change, how we will change it, and how we will do it with people, not to people. So there will be more that we'll need to do. If there's things that the Shadow DEFRA team, myself, can do in your community, visiting target seats, helping, zooming into your CLP meetings, making a difference, let us know. Because it's my job to make sure we have the policies, but it's also my job to make sure that local parties can use them to win at a local level and at a national level. We have a huge opportunity to do something here, because if we don't, my word, we're going to have a dead planet, because we're not going fast enough. So let's do all we can. Thank you.
So just before you rush to the coffee, rush to the facilities, or dash off to your next activity, I just wanted to say thank you very much to our two speakers. Thank you to all of you for your absolutely fantastic questions. And just to remind you, as well as getting Luke and his team along to your Zoom meetings, this has been hosted by Sarah. Hence, and thank you very much to RSPB for helping us put this event on. We've got a whole programme of events: plastic, energy, councillors' engagement yesterday. Today we've started off this exciting meeting on biodiversity and action that people can take. If you're not a member of CERA, please join. That's a really good route into being able to get speakers from CERA. There's a whole executive team, as well as myself, who speak on a range of subjects. If you want that assistance in your local CLP, there's a website with resources there as well. Really encourage you to join us, because we really need urgently to go on this journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you.